Okay, so Pilate expected them to say to release Jesus, but instead the chief priest persuaded the people to have them ask for Barabbas and to crucify Jesus. So Pilate, therefore, in a desire to release Jesus, called to them again and answered them, "What then shall I do with Jesus, who is called Messiah, whom you call King of the Jews?" But they cried out again, saying, "Let him be crucified." And they kept on shouting, "Crucify him, crucify him." So a third time Pilate said to them, "Why? What evil has he done? I find no guilt deserving death. So after chastising him, I will release him." Okay, so the third time Pilate declares that he is innocent, deserving death. So, once again, Pilate commits another blunder. Pilate then took Jesus, therefore, and scourged him. Now, this was totally illegal, since Pilate had already 3 times said that he was not guilty. Why should he scourge him? Now, scourging, they would take a person and bare his back and tie him to a post, and then with a whip, which had a lot of strands of leather, and tied into the leather were chunks of lead, really sharp, or bone or something like that. And as they whipped the person, the lead or the bone or whatever it was that was tied into these little strands would, of course, cut into the flesh, and as they pulled it away, it would pull off great chunks of flesh. And ordinarily it was 40 stripes. That was what the Jews usually did, 40. Although they would say they would stop at 39 just in case it was a miscount. They wouldn't want to go over. So how many of these lashings they gave Jesus is not told, but it was a very cruel thing, and it was very injurious. So this is probably what sapped all of Jesus' physical strength and caused him to be unable to bear his cross all the way to the place of crucifixion. And so from this point, Jesus went from being in a state of, we would say, excellent health to a state of near death because of the injury he received from this scourging. And so now Pilate is kind of hoping that this will satisfy the Jews. And so after they scourged him, then the soldiers made this crown of thorns and put it on his head, and they put this purple robe on him, and they began to mock him and saying, "Hail, King of the Jews," and they kept beating up on him. This was normal procedure, I think, for a person who was going to be crucified, but in the case of Jesus, it was a mocking because he had claimed to be a king. Now, the Jews and Pilate all had very low opinion of Jews. They really despised the Jews. And so if this was the king of the Jews, then they were just showing their disdain for the Jews by mocking the king, their king. Pilate therefore came out again and said to them, "Behold, I am bringing him out to you, that you may know that I find no guilt in him." Okay, so now, once again, Pilate is saying that Jesus is innocent. So Jesus came out wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe, and Pilate said to him, "Behold the man." When therefore the chief priests and the officers saw him, they cried out, saying, "Crucify, crucify." Pilate said to them, "You take and crucify him, for I find no guilt in him." Okay, so now Pilate repeats over and over again, I think 5 times in all, that that he had found no guilt in Jesus, that Jesus was innocent. Then, so he said, you take him out and crucify him yourself, but for some reason, the Jews don't take him right at that moment. They go further in their accusations. Well, he said, the Jews answered him, we have a law, and by our law he ought to die because he made himself the Son of God. So now here, the Jews get really to the issue that is at hand here. Why they said this is beyond me. If they would have taken him at that point and crucified him, that would probably have been the wisest thing for them to do. But instead, I imagine it's because of their emotional condition, their anger and everything against Jesus, that they weren't thinking logically, but they go on and say that he is, that he made himself the Son of God. Now, this gets to Pilate because although he may not be religious, he probably is superstitious. And in that time, they had all their myths and so forth of all their gods, the Roman gods and the Greek gods and all the other pagan gods. There was a lot of stories about how the gods became human, and so Pilate probably became concerned at this point that Jesus may be like these pagan gods who he had heard about, and so he didn't want to do anything which would be against God as Pilate understood. Pilate, of course, had no knowledge of the true God. He had in mind simply his pagan ideas of God. So when Pilate heard this charge, he was the more afraid, and he went again into the judgment hall and said to Jesus, where are you from? Okay, so now Paul is beginning to realize the seriousness of this. Up to this point, even though he was trying to follow the law pretty closely, although he probably wasn't taking it all that serious, but now he does get personally involved because he realizes that if he is really the Son of God and he orders him to be crucified, that gods might take out their vengeance on him. So he asked Jesus where he is from, but Jesus gave him no answer. Pilate therefore said to him, are you not talking to me? Do you not know that I have authority to crucify you and authority to release you? And then Jesus tells him under the truth of the matter. He says, you would have no authority at all over me were it not given you from above. So, in other words, Jesus is saying that any authority that he thinks he has is simply delegated authority. God has put him in this position, but the real authority is in God only. Only God has the final authority. And so Pilate was there simply because he had been put there by God. And so Jesus says, because of this, he who delivered me up to you, that would be Caiaphas and the high priests and the priests and the Sanhedrin, he who delivered me up to you has the greater sin. So now Jesus is saying that Pilate would be sinning if he condemns him to death, but that the ones who had delivered him up would have the greater sin. And so now Pilate is really starting to panic here. At this answer, Pilate kept seeking to release him, but the Jews cried out, if you release this man, You are not a friend of Caesar. Anyone making himself out to be the king is speaking against Caesar. Well, now, Pilate himself had been reprimanded by Caesar just recently for being really antagonistic to the Jews, because there's only two things that the emperor was really concerned about. One was that there be no rebellion among the people of the conquered nations, and the other is that he received their taxes. So this is the only two things that the emperor cared about: getting taxes from them, and that there be no rebellion among them. And the way Pilate was behaving in the few years previous to this, that he had been the governor, he had antagonized the Jews a number of times and brought them near to riots, and that had interfered with the collection of the taxes. And so the emperor had reprimanded Pilate a number of times already. And so Pilate was already in a little bit of trouble, and he probably knew that if anything else came up, that Pilate would be removed from his office and would probably be executed. And so now the Jews had him in a corner, because Pilate realized that the Jews had absolutely no conscience against bringing false accusations, because here they were bringing false accusations against Jesus. So if they would brought false accusations against Jesus, what would hinder them or prevent them from bringing false accusations against Pilate to the emperor? And if that happened, then Pilate was afraid that he would be removed from power and executed. So Pilate gives in to them, because they link him now with Caesar, and it says, if you let this man go, you will not be a friend of Caesar. In other words, you'll be Caesar's enemy. And so since he was already on shaky ground with Caesar, he knew that one more thing, that he would not be able to continue in his office as governor, and maybe even be executed. So at this thing, Pilate is pretty much defeated as far as trying to get Jesus off, because even now, if Pilate had said, no, he's innocent, so I'm just going to turn him loose, then he would, the Jews would bring false accusations against Pilate before Caesar. So therefore, Pilate, therefore, at hearing this, brought Jesus outside and sat him down the judgment seat in a place that is called the pavement, but in Hebrew, Gabbatha. Now it was a preparation day of the Passover, and about 6 in the morning. And he said to the Jews, behold your king. And they cried out, away with him, crucify him. And they were insistent, and cried out all the more, demanding loudly that he be crucified. Pilate said to them, shall I crucify your king? The chief priests answered, we have no king but Caesar. Okay, now the trial is turning to the point where the Jews are working themselves now into a trap, because this is now the official rejection of Jesus as the King and Messiah. So Jesus is being offered to them as their King, even though it is by a Gentile, a Roman. But the Jews now have the opportunity to receive Christ as their King and as their Messiah. But now they officially reject Jesus. So up to this point, Jesus had not been received by the leaders of the Jews. So here they actually reject Jesus. It's one thing not to receive or to be neutral, but here we have them actually rejecting Christ. So when Pilate then when he saw that nothing availed, but rather that a riot was building. Okay, this is one of the things that he, above all things, didn't want to happen. He didn't want a riot to begin, because that would have been the end of him. When he saw that a riot was building up, he took water and washed his hands before the multitude, saying, I am innocent of the blood of this righteous man. Okay, so by this gesture, Pilate indicates once more that Jesus is innocent, and that if he is put to death, that he is not to blame. Well, whether this has any carries any weight or not, the main thing is what Pilate says is that he is innocent. I am innocent of the blood of this righteous man. Okay, so not only does Pilate say that Jesus is innocent, he says that Jesus is righteous. Okay, so this is going to have such an effect upon history, and everything that has happened to the Jews can be traced back to this right here. And so Pilate says to them, you will bear witness to it. Then all the people answered and said, his blood be on us and on our children. So here the Jews bring the wrath of God not only upon themselves, but upon all their descendants. And this, as we know, over the past 2,000 years since the crucifixion of Christ, has been the history of the Jews. They have been persecuted wherever they went. They have been the recipients of so much persecution because of the crucifixion of Christ. And their voices and those of the chief priests prevailed. So Pilate, desiring to satisfy the multitude, gave sentence that it should be as they demanded. Okay, so Pilate was not willing to do what was right, to release Jesus. He only wanted to satisfy the multitude for his own selfish reasons, because if he didn't satisfy the multitude, they would riot and he would lose his position and possibly be executed. So out of pure selfish motives, he gave a sentence that Jesus should be executed. And he released for them the man Barabbas, whom they had asked for, who had been thrown into prison for insurrection and murder. But Jesus he delivered up to their will, that he should be crucified. Okay, so then once again, he's turned over to the soldiers to be crucified. And once again, they mock him, and they address him with a cloak, purple, crimson cloak, and they put the crown of thorns on him and put a reed in his right hand and bowed down before him, mocking him, saying, Hail, King of the Jews! They spit upon him and took the reed and struck him on the head. And after mocking him, they stripped him of the cloak and the purple garment and put on him his own clothing and led him out to crucify him. Okay, so all this then was done as we have already indicated, but we need to continually keep in mind that this was all done according to the will and foreknowledge of God. And this was all done for the purpose of bringing salvation to man. Jesus had to die for the sins of the world. And this is the way that God had willed that it come about. This is the way it had been prophesied in the Old Testament, as the Holy Spirit had revealed these things to the prophets, that he would be betrayed, put on trial, and found guilty, and crucified and died for the sins of the world. Okay, on the way out to the place of crucifixion, he went out. Starting out, he was carrying his own cross. That's the way it was customary. There's many different ways in which crucifixions are carried out. Sometimes only the crossbar of the cross was carried by the criminal, and he would be tied to it, and so he would be going out with the cross, carrying the crossbar across his shoulders like this. Other times the cross was fully assembled, and he carried the cross. So many different ways in which it was done, and the details aren't given here. But at any rate, we know that Jesus was extremely weak at this point because of the scourge he had received, and so physically he did not have the strength to carry it. And so as they were proceeding out, they found a man of Cyrene who was passing by, Simon by name, the father of Alexander and Rufus, coming in from the country. Him they seized and laid hold and laid on him the cross, and compelled him to bear it behind Jesus. So probably the cross was fully assembled, and had to carry the whole thing, and it would be quite heavy. Because they followed him a great multitude of people, and the women who also were bewailing and lamenting him. But Jesus turned to them and said, "Daughters of Jerusalem, do not weep for me, but weep for yourselves and for your children." Okay, the people had just said that his blood be upon us and upon our children. And so now Jesus is turning to the women and says, weep for your children, because of the judgment of God which will be upon them for their rejecting of Christ and crucifying him. Ordinarily, for a Jewish woman at any rate, they wanted to have children because they considered that to be a sign of the blessing of God. But Jesus says to them, for behold, the days are coming in which they will say, blessed are the barren, and the wombs which never bore, and the breasts which never nursed. Well, why was that? Well, because all these mothers would be seeing their children tortured and put to death and persecuted and everything. So if the woman didn't have children, then she would be spared that grief of seeing her own children receiving all of the torments and everything. And then he said, then will they begin to say to the mountains, fall on us, and to the hills, cover us. Okay, now this we know is going to take place in the Great Tribulation. And if we think that all that the Jews have suffered from the time of the rejection of Christ until now was bad, that's nothing compared to what the Jews are going to suffer during the Great Tribulation. At that time, it will be so bad that they will desire death in any way. In the book of Revelation, it says they will even seek death and will not be able to find it. And they will call upon the hills. In other words, it would be better to get caught in a landslide and be covered in that way, to die, than for them to endure the torture that they will be going through. And then this last sentence, for if they do these things in the tree that is green, what will happen in the dry. Okay, now at this point, God was still dealing with the nation of Israel, and they still had their opportunity to receive Christ, but they had just turned it down. And so just like a fire doesn't burn very well in wood that is still, that's just been cut, it's still green. But when after the wood has been cut down for a while and it's all dried out, then it burns, hotter and so forth. So Jesus is saying that at that moment, the tree was green. He'd been talking about persecution and trouble and everything that the Jews were going to receive. And so there's two things that were, the two main things that were still future. One was the destruction of Jerusalem, which happened about 40 years after Christ was crucified. And in that time, the Jews had rebelled and the Romans had come, and there were several million, at least 1 million Jews were killed when the Jews, when the Romans destroyed Jerusalem. Well, that was simply kind of like a preview of what's going to happen during the Great Tribulation. And so if that's what happened when the tree was green, then what's going to happen when the tree is dry? In other words, during the Great Tribulation, is the torture and everything they're going to receive is going to be so much greater. Okay, so Jesus is telling them that they need to repent and to receive Him and to weep for themselves is what He meant. Is what He's actually telling them to do, is to repent and get right with God, because of the Jews' rejection of Christ, things are going to get so much worse for them. Okay, so we'll stop here and take up here next time.